Welcome to Fireside Gaming. I'm Billum and I grew up in the 90s, and that means that I was around for the anime explosion that hit the US with the help of Toonami and several other programming blocks aimed at children. And while I don't watch as much anime as I used to growing up, there's no denying that I still have a deep love for it. One of the first anime I ever watched was Dragon Ball Z. When that show hit Cartoon Network, it immediately became the talk of the schoolyard. And I probably don't need to tell you how big of a phenomenon it was. After all, Dragon Ball is still around to this day with new chapters of the Super manga as well as Super movies we get from time to time. But the hype experience back then was something different. Heck, I've still got a set of DBZ party supplies from a friend's birthday party way back when. And despite this popularity, there was a severe lack of Dragon Ball Z games. The series started running back in 1996, but the first official US release of a DBZ game wasn't until 6 years later with the release of Legacy of Goku in 2002. And yes, I know about Dragon Power, but that hardly counts considering it was released on the NES before DBZ even got a dub. Also, it's Dragon Ball and not Dragon Ball Z, and that does matter for the sake of my point. No matter the case, the idea of the US not capitalizing on DBZ games for such a long period of time just blows my mind. And the first game we got was Legacy of Goku? Listen, I had the game and I enjoyed it and everything like that. I mean, I've even got the poster of it still hanging on my wall as I speak. But if memory serves, it wasn't all that good. It also wasn't my first DBZ game as I didn't have a Game Boy Advance when it came out. Instead, I was still rocking my Atomic Purple Game Boy Color in 2002. And while the GBA may have been getting the limelight, there was a singular DBZ game that graced the handheld in the US. Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors. And that is way too many words for me to keep saying without wasting loads of time on multiple takes, so let's cut it down to LSW from now on. The amount of time I spent on this game as a kid feels astronomical. It probably wasn't, as the game only takes about 10 hours to beat, but I also wasn't very good at it at the time either. And in LSW's defense, I also didn't read the manual as a kid. And while that might not seem like a big deal in a DBZ game, this isn't a beat-em-up or a fighting game. No, LSW is a turn-based card battle game. If you're like me, that's probably not what you would expect from a DBZ game, but trust me, there's actually a long history of games in this style going all the way back to the Famicom. So while LSW wasn't exactly breaking any new ground for the series, it wasn't what the DBZ audience in the US was expecting. The real question players are likely going to be asking at this point is it any good? And that's more complicated than just a simple yes or no answer. Let's break it down. Oh, but real quick, I guess I should talk about the game's story. First off, I'm not covering anything in detail, but I suppose I'll give you a spoiler warning in case any of you viewers haven't seen DBZ yet. But that seems kind of unlikely since you clicked on this video. LSW is a condensed retelling of the entirety of Dragon Ball Z. That means it kicks off with the death of Goku in the battle with Raditz at the start of the Saiyan saga, and it ends with the defeat of Kid Buu at the end of the Majin Buu saga. That's a massive amount of content, and it's stretched out across 30 scenarios, which basically means fights. And you know what the craziest thing about this is? Legendary Super Warriors came out in the US on November 8th, 2002. The final episode of Dragon Ball Z aired in the US on April 7th, 2003. That means this game covered the end of DBZ 5 months earlier than the anime did in the US. Weird, right? I even remember getting this for Christmas in 2002 and playing a good ways into it before the anime ended. I can't remember if I stopped playing to wait for the anime to finish, or if I just beat it and didn't care. I'm not really sure. My memory concerning that is a bit fuzzy. To be clear, I wouldn't have gotten too much in spoilers anyway. When I said this was a condensed version of the events in DBZ, I wasn't joking. Many of the events in the anime are quickly summarized or just plainly skipped over. Then there's the stuff that goes completely off course from the anime, like Goten and Trunks training against future Trunks in the hyperbolic time chamber during the Buu saga. And if those oddities aren't enough, the translation for this game is garbage. It can be somewhat hard keeping up with what the characters are talking about as the dialogue is all over the place. And that's not helped by this weird censorship where characters sometimes can't talk about death. It results in a lot of funny scenes where they instead talk about being lost. A perfect example comes from when Cell is preparing to blow up after Gohan knocks Android 18 out of him. Instead of saying everyone is going to die, he says everyone is going to lost, and that the entire planet will lost. This reminds me of the early Ocean dub of DBZ when characters were sent to another dimension instead of dying. And while it's kind of silly, I can't bring myself to hate it. The poor translation is just a product of its time, and it got a good few chuckles out of me during my playthrough. And even with this strange censorship in the game, quite a few naughty words slipped into the script. That's despite its E for everyone rating, but let's not get too hung up on that. I said I wouldn't spend too much time on the story section this time around, and I'm gonna hold myself to that, so let's get into the gameplay. Before players ever get into battle, they'll have a few decisions to make. First up is the character they want to play as. All throughout LSW, players can basically choose to take part in battles with any of the characters present at that point of the anime. And this is something that you have to keep in mind, as the character chosen does gain experience from battles and will level up. With each level gained, players can put a point into one stat. The options are health, strength, ki, and speed. Health is pretty explanatory already. Strength determines the damage of physical attacks, ki determines the damage of beam attacks, and speed affects a few different things. That includes which character goes first in battle, the accuracy of their attacks, as well as the chance of a character to dodge. Once players have chosen the character they want to use in battle, they then have to adjust their deck accordingly. After all, not all of the characters know the same moves. You can't have Piccolo using the Destructo Disc, just like how Krillin can't use the Special Beam Cannon. This is one of the negatives of LSW, as it means players will have to adjust their decks frequently if they switch between characters often between battles. And there's nothing worse than jumping into a fight but forgetting to change your deck, leaving you unable to use some of the cards that show up. You might as well just soft reset back to the main screen if you find yourself in this position. So we have our chosen character, and we have our deck built, but what kind of cards make up that deck? LSW includes 4 basic card types. They are Command, Attack, Defense, and Support. Command cards mostly cover the basic attacks players will use in the game. These come in the form of stage attacks, such as 3-stage, 4-stage, 5-stage, and so on. The higher number of stage attack the player chooses, the longer the button prompt required to complete that attack. These attacks also build up CC, which is going to help us use other cards, such as attack, defense, or support cards. Moving on to attack cards, these are the main way players will win fights and don't require button prompts to perform. Attack cards come in 2 flavors, physical and beam. Depending on the character's stats, they might prefer one type of attack over the other. I was a heavy beam user in my playthrough and focused on ki when leveling up. That means there were loads of Kamehamehas and Masenkos used on my enemies. But there's also the options for continuous punches and kicks, as well as other special attacks, like Gohan's Dunk Shot, that make use of the strength stat instead. No matter which route the player goes, attack cards are devastating. If you play your cards right, you might only need to use 1 or 2 of these to defeat an opponent, and it bears mentioning that attack cards can only be used on the player's attack phase. With defense cards, a lot more of the strategy of LSW comes into play, and that's because not all defense cards are built equal. For example, there's the Avoid and Endurance cards. Avoid allows the player to completely dodge a beam attack, but if this is used whenever the enemy uses a physical attack, you'll take it to the face, no damage reduction or anything. On the flip side of that, Endurance has the player performing a strong block, which increases the resistance to both beam and physical attacks. You'll still take damage, but it's a safer bet since players can't know what type of attack an enemy is going to use in advance. Also, these cards are limited to use during a player's defense phase. Finally, we have support cards. There's various ones with different effects. Just a few worth mentioning are Dende for healing the player, Bulma for reducing the enemy's strength, King Kai increasing ki, and so forth and so on. It also bears mentioning that players can use support cards during both the attack and defense phases. On top of all of this, there's a few other deck options worth mentioning before we get into the actual battles themselves. Each character has a limit deck. The cards in this deck can be used as much as the player wants. However, they first have to perform the Gather Ki action before they have access to them. You'll basically want to fill this deck with 1 high stage command card and then 2 signature attack cards. For example, I often kept a 5-stage attack card, Super Kamehameha, and Spirit Bomb in Goku's limit deck. The joint deck that players are shown during battle is actually their hand. Each turn, a player draws a new card from their deck. This is where command, attack, defense, and support go. Players do have a hand size limit, so they'll want to use cards from their hand regularly. And last but not least is the basic deck. This is made up of a few actions that change depending on the phase of the turn. If you're in attack phase, it allows the player to perform a 3-stage attack or to gather ki. Gathering ki allows the use of limit moves, and it also adds 4-stage attack to the basic deck. If the player is in defense phase, they can move to different parts of the battlefield or guard. The cards in the basic deck never run out. The flow of battle in LSW basically works like this. You start the battle and hopefully go first, putting you in attack phase. You'll perform stage attacks to build up CC while also making sure to gather ki. When the opportunity presents itself, players can attack the enemy with strong attacks to lower their health until they win the battle. Keep in mind that you'll also have to balance using support cards and defense cards, which also cost CC to stay alive. And there's also field positioning to take into account. When the character is in the back, they'll take less damage from enemy attacks, but they also won't deal as much damage with their own. The opposite is true for characters in the front. Also, the closer the characters are together, the more time they have to perform the button prompts for stage attacks. If quick reaction time isn't your strength, you can always remain closer to the enemy to give you more time to pull off those button presses, but it does come with the risk of taking more damage. The elevation of a character also affects the damage that they take. A character in the air will take less damage from physical attacks. If the character is on the ground, the damage from beam attacks will be reduced. Combine that with the other buffs and debuffs that I just mentioned, and I'm sure you can see that positioning matters a lot in LSW. I know all of this probably sounds really complex, but it comes naturally once you're playing the game, or at least it did for me with just a couple of battles. The game's biggest problem is its poor translation, which makes it hard to know what some cards do without looking them up online. And while everything is turn-based, these battles really can bring a sense of urgency with them. Trying to build up CC and pull off a massive beam attack before the enemy brings with it a massive rush that kept me on the edge of my seat more than I expected. I even had a few of those gamer moments where things got intense and I sat up on the edge of my couch for my stage attacks. The biggest downside is enemies will fall into certain patterns that can make them easy to read. This removes some of the difficulty once players recognize them, but they do sometimes do something unexpected to keep you on your toes. There's also some fun to have with the game via a battle mode that's unlocked after beating the main story. This lets players take some characters into battles that they normally couldn't. It can create some fun scenarios, such as Ultimate Gohan against Perfect Cell. My only problem with these extra battles is that the bad guys aren't unlocked by beating the game. Instead, you have to play the game a second time and use specific characters in certain battles to get them. That's a bit much for me, and I didn't do it during my playthrough. If you're crazy enough to, then the game rewards you with 28 characters to play as, with many of them having multiple forms. I'll also mention that LSW does feature a few points where players are in a top-down field and can explore. This can net them some hidden cards to help them get through the game, but they aren't that important. So much so that I completely forgot about them and had to add this bit in after I had already written the script. And while LSW is a Game Boy Color game, its sprites aren't lacking. The game looks incredibly good and has a lot of charm to it. It captures the overall profile of the characters while perfectly shrinking them down once for battle sprites and then again for field sprites. They even have that same style of gooby mouth that Link sports in the original Legend of Zelda. I may end up making me a Perler bead sprite of Gohan or Krillin one of these days. I feel like it's one of those things that I could just kind of have sitting on my shelf, look at it every once in a while, and just smile. The music in LSW is incredibly intense for the Game Boy Color. There's not much of it if I'm being honest, but it makes up for it by going hard. The battle music has been stuck in my head ever since I played this game as a kid, and while the GBC sound profile can bother my ears at times, this is one that I'm willing to forgive as I love it so much. I'm personally a fan of turn-based RPGs as well as card battle games, so LSW is right up my alley, but that doesn't mean there aren't problems with it. The butchered story is disappointing, and the poor translation can make it hard to understand how to play the game. And despite those problems, I couldn't help but to love my recent playthrough of the game, even more so than when I was a kid. I chalk that up to having a better understanding of the combat this time around. Anyone looking to play Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors will have to keep an eye out for it on the Game Boy Color. The game hasn't been released outside of that, unfortunately. Luckily, it's not too expensive at about $20 loose at the time of making this video. Personally, I'd wait to see if the retro game market calms down a little bit if you're considering buying the game. It feels more like a $10 game to me, maybe $15 if you're a hardcore DBZ fan. Thanks for sticking around for my retrospective of Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors, and until next time, take it easy.